This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show that's all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Tuke, the Director of Ministry at ODB Films, and today we look at the Franciscans. How is it possible that we have not done this show yet? I had a wonderful listener say, "What the heck? Where's my Franciscan show?" So I thought this is a brilliant opportunity. Plus, who doesn't love St. Francis of Assisi? Now, here's the deal, though. If we're going to do a Franciscans show, we've got to talk about St. Francis of Assisi, and we got to talk about St. Bonaventure. So it's really 3 shows in one, and we'll do the best we can with the time, all right? So, born circa 1181 in Assisi, which was a territory of the Duke of Spoleto, Italy. Our beloved St. Francis of Assisi, though revered today, he started his life pretty much as a sinner. His dad was a wealthy cloth merchant. He owned a bunch of farmland around Assisi. His mom was this gorgeous French woman. Francis was not in want during his youth, all right? He had whatever he wanted. He was pretty much spoiled. Indulged himself with fine wine, food, lots of wild celebrations, all kinds of great stories about him. So by age 14, he had pretty much left school and became known as this rebellious teenager who frequently drank, partied, broke the city curfew, rock and roll with Francis of Assisi, all right? So he was also known for his charm and his vanity. So he had a real reputation as a young man. In all these privileged surroundings, though, Francis of Assisi pretty much learned the skills of archery, wrestling, horsemanship. He was a really able-bodied guy. He was expected to follow in his dad's family business, his family footsteps, the textile business, but he was really bored by the idea of a life in the clothing trade. So instead of planning a future as a merchant, he started to kind of daydream of a future as a knight. And you got to remember, like, knights were medieval action heroes, and if Francis had any ambition at all, he was a pretty snobby little brat, it was to be a war hero like them. And it actually wasn't too long before the opportunity for an engaged warfare called him out. So in 1202, war broke out between Assisi and Perugia, and Francis eagerly took his place with the cavalry. So little did he know at the time, his experience with war would pretty much change him forever. I mean, this experience, and a lot of people don't talk about this experience, but it really molded him into this sort of warrior for Christ. So Francis and the men of Assisi, they come under attack. They're in the face of massive outnumbers, and they run away. And the whole battlefield is soon covered with the bodies of just these butchered, mutilated men screaming in agony. Francis talks about this later on in his life. Most of the surviving Assisi troops were immediately put to death. Unskilled, no combat experience. Our guy Francis was quickly captured by enemy soldiers. So he's dressed like an aristocrat. He's wearing expensive new armor. He was pretty much quickly considered worthy of a really high ransom. And the soldiers decided to spare his life. So he and all the other wealthy troops were taken as prisoners and then led off to this sort of gross, dank underground cell. So Francis spends nearly a year in these horrible conditions, awaiting his father's payment, during which time he may very well have contracted a serious disease. We don't really know, but he fought disease his entire life. Also, during this time, he would later report that he began to receive visions from God. So after a year of negotiations, Francis' ransom was accepted, and he was released from prison in 1203. When he came back to Assisi, however, Francis was a very different man. So upon his return, he was dangerously sick, both mind and body. I mean, battle-fatigued, casualty of war, but also just broken guy, right? So one day, the legend has it, while riding on a horse in the local countryside, Francis encounters a leper. Now, prior to the war, Francis would have run from the leper, but on this occasion, his behavior was very different. And viewing the leper as kind of a symbol of moral conscience, or as Jesus incognito, basically, according to some religious scholars, he embraced and he kissed him, and later described the experience as feeling, quote, a sweetness in his mouth. Now, after this incident, Francis felt an indescribable freedom. His earlier lifestyle really had just kind of lost all of its appeal. Now, subsequently, Francis, now in his early 20s, began turning his focus toward God. Now, instead of working, he spent an ever-increasing amount of time at a remote mountain hideaway, as well as in old, quiet churches around Assisi, praying, looking for answers, and helping to nurse lepers. And it's during this time, while praying before an old Byzantine crucifix at the church of San Damiano, that Francis reportedly heard the voice of Christ, who told him to rebuild the Christian church and to live a life of extreme poverty. And Francis obeyed. He devoted himself to Christianity. He began preaching around Assisi, and he was soon joined by 12 loyal followers. Okay, I've been in the church. I've been in the little church in Assisi. A lot of people have. It's a tourist mecca. And I was 6 inches from the cross, from the cross of San Damiano. And I have to tell you, man, my knees were shaken. It dropped me. It just blew my mind how powerful it was to know that was the cross that spoke to Francis. Amazing stuff, right? Now, at the time, some regarded Francis as just a madman or a total fool, but others viewed him as really one of the greatest examples of how to live the Christian ideal since Jesus Christ himself. Now, whether the culture thought he was really touched by God or simply a mad, crazy guy misinterpreting hallucinations brought on by mental illness and or poor health, it doesn't matter. Francis of Assisi quickly became very well known throughout the Christian world. So after his epiphany at the Church of San Damiano, Francis experiences another defining moment in his life. In order to raise money to rebuild the Christian church, he sold a bolt of cloth from his father's shop along with his horse, which he loved. And his dad just was furious upon learning about his son's actions, and he grabs Francis and he drags him before the local bishop. The bishop told Francis to return his dad's money, to which his reaction was extraordinary. He took off all his clothes, and along with them, he returned the money back to his dad, declaring that God was now the only father that he recognized. And this event is basically, it's credited as Francis's final conversion, and there's really no indication that Francis and his dad ever spoke again, which is a tragedy, except that, we don't know the details of that relationship, and that might have been the exact change that was really needed. So the bishop gave Francis a rough tunic, and dressed in these new humble clothes, Francis left Assisi. Now, unluckily for him, the first people he met on the road were a group of dangerous thieves who beat him within an inch of his life. And despite his wounds, Francis was elated. From now on, he basically would live according to the gospel. He speaks about that incident later on in his life. So Francis's embrace of Christ-like poverty was really this radical notion at the time. You have to understand how big of a deal that was at the time, especially. I mean, it is today, but at the time, revolutionary. So the Christian church was tremendously rich, much like the people leading it, which really concerned Francis and a lot of other people who felt that the long-held apostolic ideals had really just kind of eroded, going back to the original 12. So Francis set out on a mission to restore his own original values to this now really decadent church. And with his incredible charisma, he drew thousands of followers to him. They listened to Francis' sermons and joined in his way of life. His followers became known as Franciscan friars. Now, continuously pushing himself in this quest for kind of spiritual perfection, Francis was soon preaching in up to 5 villages per day, teaching a new kind of emotional and personal Christian religion that everyday people could understand. He really brought Christianity back to the people in the grassroots. He even went so far as to preach to animals, which we love to make a big deal of today. It's not as big of a deal at the time of Francis. They garnered him a ton of criticism, though, from some of the people around him. It earned him the nickname God's Fool. But Francis' message was spread so far and wide, thousands of people were really captivated by what they heard. In 1224, Francis reportedly received a vision that left him with the stigmata of Christ, the marks resembling the wounds that Jesus Christ suffered when he was crucified through his hands, and the gaping lance wound in his side. And this made Francis kind of the first person to receive the holy wounds of the stigmata. That's a really big deal. So they would remain visible for the rest of his life because of all this early work and all this, treating lepers. A lot of people believe that the wounds were actually symptoms of leprosy, but record has it that he received the true stigmata. So as Francis approached his death, many predicted that he was a saint in the making, a lot like, the Mother Teresa's and St. John Paul II, but people just knew they were in the midst of holiness even while he was alive. When his health really began to decline more rapidly, Francis went home. Knights were sent from Assisi to guard him and to make sure that no one from any neighboring towns would carry him off. You got to remember, the body of a saint was viewed at the time as an extremely valuable relic that would bring, among many things, glory to the town where it rested. We did a whole show on relics. You should check that out because we actually talk about that. So he was guarded in his failing health. Francis, he died on October 3rd, 1226, at the age of 44 in Assisi, Italy. That is not very old. Today, Francis has obviously a lasting, resonance with millions of followers across the globe. He was canonized as a saint just 2 years after his death on July 16th, 1228, by his former protector, Pope Gregory IX. And today, St. Francis of Assisi is the patron saint for ecologists, title honoring his boundless love for animals and nature. In 2013, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis, chose to honor St. Francis by taking his name. So the Order of Friars Minor, OFMs, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, is a fraternity. You got to think of it that way. In a more sort of complete fulfillment of their baptismal consecration and in answer to the divine call, a friar, the OFMs, they give themselves totally to God, their supreme love, through really profession of obedience, poverty, and chastity, which they are to live in the spirit of St. Francis. That's what an OFM is. That's what a Franciscan is. So the Friars Minor, they really embody in the people of God, paying attention to the new signs of the times, responding to the conditions of a developing world. They're always to be of one mind with the church, total union with the Roman Catholic Church. They are to adopt as their own and really foster as much as they can the church's undertakings and its aims. That's the roots. Now, you can imagine as society grows and the Franciscan order grows, things start to challenge those original conventions that Francis laid down. And the order starts to own property, and they actually start to kind of succumb to some of the royalty that really plagued the church. Along comes St. Bonaventure. Now, the most powerful force of change in the 13th century were, and this is good to know as we understand St. Bonaventure, there were two new institutions. There was the university system and then like the mendicant religious orders. Now, that's what Franciscans are, mendicant. It means given to begging. So the future that St. Bonaventure was closely involved in included both of those, universities and, of course, the Franciscan order. He became a leading theologian, a successful teacher, and a writer. He rose to high office in the church, and he was really the Franciscan order's second founder, okay? So born in Viterbo in central Italy in 1221, he studied theology at the University of Paris, where he later became a lecturer and a writer. In 1208, Francis of Assisi had gathered his band who followed the gospel and based their lives completely on poverty and simplicity. In 1210, Pope Innocent III acknowledged them as a religious order and approved the rule of that Francis presented. Bonaventure came into contact with the Franciscans through his university tutor, Alexander of Hales, and was inspired to join them. So in many ways, the Franciscans were revolutionaries, like we talked about. Their life of poverty was in direct opposition to affluence and self-indulgence they saw all around them. And they took vows and they lived in community, but they went about preaching and performing pastoral duties, okay? Now, they had considerable freedom and were becoming very popular and successful in the academic field also. So this aroused some jealousy among secular clergy, but after Pope Alexander IV investigated that controversy, the friars were totally vindicated. Now, when Bonaventure was 36, he became Minister General of the order and was faced with a fundamental problem. Some friars wanted the rules relaxed, while others wanted them to be even more strict. So Bonaventure succeeded in basically reconciling these two factions, bringing the whole order back to the original Franciscan ideals. And for this reason, he became known as the second founder of the order. So in 1260, he wrote a Life of St. Francis, which became basically accepted as the standard biography. Okay, he made some changes in the administration of the order, and he introduced the custom of ringing a bell at nightfall in honor of the Annunciation. And this was the origin of the Angelus, needless to say, kind of cool. In 1273, much against his will, Bonaventure was created Cardinal Bishop of Albano by Pope Gregory X, who asked him the following year to direct the Council of Lyons, which was a huge deal, which tried to mend the schism between the Greek Church and the Roman Church. So St. Bonaventure, super Franciscan, also very much a part of trying to heal the Eastern Schism. It was largely due to the efforts of Bonaventure and his friars that the Greeks actually agreed to accept union with the Western Church at all. Now, sadly, that union didn't last. But when Bonaventure died on the 15th of July, 1274, age 53, he felt that all his diplomatic efforts had been well worthwhile. It was a big deal. He was just a dignitary, really. He's been called the Seraphic Doctor because he basically combined piety with learning, which is still a core value of the Franciscans. He was an amazing scholar. He chose to lead a life of humility and poverty, which is incredible because there could have been a lot of fame, could have been a lot of money there. Through his studies, he really came to understand the natural world. As a follower of Francis, he learned how to love and appreciate that world, the ecology of our surroundings and everything in it. Really kind of the founder of eco-theology in many ways. He has a lot to do and a lot to teach us about love for God and respect for all creation. It was really a lot of the ethos behind Laudato Si from Pope Francis. So we thank God for his life. I mean, this guy, this is the big deal. He really saved the Franciscan order from disarray and schism. He was a friar, and he was loved pretty much by everybody around him. But it doesn't change the fact that today there's a lot of Franciscans. Why does it seem like there are so many different kinds of Franciscans? It's not because of schism. So like the Benedictines, the Franciscans also underwent like a number of reforms throughout history, but they were really consolidated in 1897 into three main bodies, okay? So there's the Friars Minor, like we've talked about, the Conventuals, and the Capuchins. Now, some Franciscan communities may be more contemplative in nature, such as the Franciscan Sisters of Nazareth, but those three, Friars Minor, Conventuals, and Capuchins, are really the core. Okay, so let's break those down. So the Friars Minor were the result of a large consolidation of tons of groups. The Observants, the Discalced, the Recollects, the Reformati. There was a bunch of names like that by Pope Leo XII in 1897. So today, the Friars Minor compose the largest body of the Franciscan order, and they're actually kind of criticized for being the most lenient, but they are the largest, true to the Franciscan order, okay? The Conventuals, the Friars Minor Conventual, FMC, so the Conventual Franciscans, they were one of the first reforms of the Franciscan order. So they desired to apply the Franciscan spirit to new applications, such as like urban city apostolates, rather than remaining in rural areas. And as such, they were basically granted various dispensations to sort of relax certain rules in order to carry out specific apostolates. So today, the Conventuals have taken on a more academic, more of a Marian spirit, heavily influenced by St. Maximilian Kolbe, who also was a Conventual. So the most notable Conventuals, the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, who have a sister branch as well, they take a fourth vow of total consecration to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and they have a very active sort of media apostolate, okay? Friars Minor Capuchin, FMCs, the Capuchin reform desired a return to a much stricter observance of the Franciscan rule. As such, so Capuchin Franciscans tend to be the most active, with a much stronger emphasis on the corporal works of mercy. A Capuchin Franciscan would be more likely to be seen feeding the poor or street evangelizing rather than writing a book on the liturgy or studying patristics. So the most valuable Capuchins today are the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal, and we should just do a show just on these guys because they're just oh my gosh, CFRs or Capuchin Friars of the Renewal, or FFRs, some people call them Franciscan Friars of the Renewal. Like many religious communities, though, the Franciscans have suffered from just a decline in vocations over the past 40 years, many of which have become kind of more secularized, basically de-emphasizing certain traditions of Franciscan heritage, penance and mortification, fasting on bread and water, use of certain disciplines, etc. So it's not uncommon today to see friars, watching television or going to the movies and ice cream on a Saturday night. However, like the Benedictines, the communities of more lax traditions actually seem to be diminishing, and they're being replaced by younger communities that are much more devoted to a living, really more of a radical, and by radical I mean rooted, like deeply rooted, and countercultural way of life. The Sisters of Nazareth, Friars of the Immaculate, Sisters of the Immaculate, Friars of the Renewal, Sisters of the Renewal, and the Franciscan Friars of the Primitive Observance, they're all growing in number. There's something to say for that uber discipline. So that's it. That's the Franciscans. I know I didn't talk about St. Clare of Assisi. I know I kind of want to devote a show just to her. I know that their friendship was beautiful. It really evolved more toward the end of Francis's life, and there's a lot to it. But this show is really about the Franciscans and their origins, and I hope it gives you a better understanding of just the beautiful, just the incredible movement that the Franciscans are doing in the church, just truly an apostolate of Christ. Thanks for listening. Sincerely, we are partners in the journey of faith. I hope you'll share this Renovo podcast with your friends and foes. Send your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Keep them coming. The next 5 shows are all based on suggestions. I love it so much. Also, always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.